overview of King Conservation District's Landowner Incentive Program, or LIP for short. My name is Brett Anderson. I'm a forest stewardship planner here at the Conservation District. And before I get started with the presentation itself, I just wanted to go over a couple of quick logistical things here. First off, everybody's cameras have been turned off and microphones have been muted. If you have questions at any point throughout the presentation, please use the chat feature to ask those. If you look towards the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little speech bubble icon that says chat underneath it. And if you click that separate window will pop up for you to be able to type questions into. And please chat only to the moderator to ask your questions, and do that by clicking on the drop-down menu right above type message here and select moderator. This webinar is also going to be recorded, and we'll follow up with an email to a link to that recording, as well as a copy of the slides once we finish processing that for everybody. And also, before we get started with the presentation, I have just a couple of quick questions we want to ask you all, just to gauge current baseline knowledge, what everybody knows about our program, how familiar you are with it. So we're going to go ahead and start that poll now. Should see a separate window popping up on your screen with a couple of multiple choice questions. If you don't know the answer to any of them, not a big deal. That's kind of why we're doing this presentation. We just want to see where everybody's at now. And we're also going to ask these questions at the end of the presentation, just to judge how effective the presentation was and to see what all everybody learned. So go ahead and take just a minute and read through those questions, answer them to the best of your ability, and we'll go ahead and continue once we get everybody's responses to those questions. Okay, so I guess we're having some technical difficulties with the poll, so we're just going to go ahead and move past that and get right into today's presentation. So I just wanted to start with a brief outline of the talk, the topics that I'm going to be covering today. I'm going to start with talking about KCD as an organization, who we are and what we do for those of you who aren't familiar with us, as well as an introduction to the forest management staff they'd be most directly engaging with if you do decide to pursue a forest LIP project with us. I'll give just a little bit of historical context into active forest management, why it's important, why it's work that we encourage our forest landowners to do, and why we have a program dedicated to help with that. I'll talk about that program, the LIP, Landowner Incentive Program, give an overview of it, as well as some of the program requirements. I'm going to pause at that point for questions about the program itself before I continue on getting a little bit more in detail about the projects themselves, what type of activities we include in those projects, typical project timelines, and that sort of thing. Lastly, I'll end with a brief summary of tonight's presentation, as well as a question and answer session. And I'll also have links to a couple of additional resources, some partner agencies, and things that we thought might be useful for forest landowners. So who is King Conservation District? I always like to start answering that question by saying who we're not. We're not King County. We're totally separate from county government. We're what's called a special purpose district, like a school district or a fire district. And our special purpose, so to speak, is natural resource management and conservation. We share the name King because our service boundary is most to all of King County. Conservation districts were formed back in the Dust Bowl times, about in the 1930s, to help farmers implement better and more sustainable agriculture practices, and over time have evolved to meet the local needs around resource management and resource conservation in their service areas. Excuse me. On the slide, you'll see just a couple of broad categories that are kind of representative of the types of services that we offer. And today's talk is going to be focused on a portion of those services that are geared towards helping forest landowners. Our services can be kind of thought of in three different broad types. We provide educational services like tonight's webinar, as well as in-person classes and workshops, as well as property tours that really highlight some of the practices that we recommend around resource management. The second category is called technical assistance, which is really more one-on-one, working directly with a particular landowner who has questions or concerns around some of the natural resources on their property. It can take the form of a phone call, it can be an email exchange, it can also be an on-site in-person visit where KCD staff will come out to your property, walk your property with you. You can point out the things that you're concerned about, and we can also identify potential opportunities for management activities. I mentioned we're not part of King County. We're also non-regulatory and non-enforcement. Everything that we do, all of our services relies on voluntary participation from landowners, starting with a request for assistance. We'll never approach you, knock on your door, or call you out of the blue telling you to do something. We rely on you to be interested in our assistance. So the forest management staff, again, that you would be most directly engaging with if you do decide to pursue an LIP project with us, are going to be our forestry program manager, Mike Lasecki, pictured there on the left. He kind of works behind the scenes, keeping the wheels greased, making sure our program's moving along nice and smooth. And myself, Brett Anderson, there on the right, and I handle a lot of the technical assistance and some of the financial assistance components of our forestry program. So just to provide a little historical context into active forest management, why it's something that we feel is important, why we have this program dedicated to helping people do this. A couple of pictures on the screen showing kind of what we think of when we think of a healthy, intact native forest. Some of the main kind of takeaways, key features that we're looking at here, looking at the tree layer, the canopy layer, we see trees of different sizes, different ages, different species. From old 100-year-old trees down to new saplings, kind of that next generation of canopy trees in the understory there. We also see a broad range of native shrubs. And all of these things contribute to these forests being very highly functioning, very highly complex ecosystems that provide not only a wide range of habitat values for wildlife, but also what we term ecosystem services, kind of passive benefits that we as humans benefit from just by forests being present. We don't necessarily have to be benefiting from resources we're pulling out of these forests, but things like carbon storage or contributing to the maintenance of our hydrology of the area or the water cycle. Forests do those things just by existing, basically. And that's not to say that managing for timber excludes these benefits. Properly managed timber plantations can provide still wide ranges of these types of benefits. New forests are just as beneficial, just as valuable as old forests in the grand scheme of things. However, when lands are poorly managed or managed for a long period of time and then abandoned or no longer managed, that's when what we call degradation of these ecosystems occurs. The natural trajectory, the natural path of those forests has been changed for so long that natural processes might not be able to recover those forests. So this is an example of what we think of when we think of a degraded forest. And looking at the same sorts of things, the overstory on this forest is composed mostly of a single species. It looks like red alder. It's all about the same same age, and same size. The understory looks like it's composed mostly of invasive Himalayan blackberry. And we've lost a lot of the complexity, a lot of that diversity. And as such, we've lost a lot of the, again, habitat values of this forest, as well as the ecosystem type of functions of this forest. And so all of these things, this loss of complexity, the loss of species diversity, and the presence of invasive species, these are all what we term resource concerns. And generally speaking, a resource concern is some change in structure or composition of a forest that results in a net loss of functionality or a decrease in overall forest health. And a lot of a common question I get asked is, well, it's nature. Shouldn't nature be able to handle itself best? Shouldn't a hands-off approach be best? And sometimes the answer is yes, but a lot of the times it's either it depends or no, not really. And two of the main reasons for that is that really the only natural disturbance process that can address the resource concern, especially of invasive species, is going to be a wildfire. And we've been very good at excluding wildfire from a lot of our forests, and especially in more urban developed areas where most everybody lives. And it would also rely on having a nice, healthy, intact forest nearby to provide that seed source to revegetate and kind of start that next generation of forests. If we don't have that nearby, there's a very high likelihood that invasive species are going to reclaim that site and continue, that land will continue to be degraded until another disturbance occurs. And just to kind of illustrate this fragmentation, this lack of native forests, or lack of likelihood of having a healthy native forest nearby, I found this is an image of the Lake Youngs area. You can see Lake Youngs near the bottom center of your screen. And this is in 1936, and this land has been managed for timber for several decades at this point, but there's still pretty continuous forest cover over this entire area. However, if we fast forward to 1998, you can see this area has been very heavily developed. That forest exists just in small pieces and chunks, and the odds of a disturbance happening in one of those forests and having a nice native healthy forest nearby to reseed that area is pretty unlikely. There's a very good chance that, again, those invasive species, if they're present, are going to dominate that site. I can continue to talk about this stuff probably for the rest of this hour, but I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that's enough to convince you all that active forest management is important and necessary. And now I'm going to go ahead and get into how we can help you as forest landowners be good active managers of your forests. And that is with our landowner incentive program. So I'm going to talk about what it is. I'll talk about who is eligible to apply for this program, and also what the program requirements are. And after I finish that session, I'm going to have just a quick break for questions, if any came in, about the program itself, before I start talking a little bit more in detail about our LIP projects. So what is the Landowner Incentive Program? It's the financial assistance piece of the KCD puzzle, and more specifically, it's financial assistance in the form of helping offset the cost of bringing professional contractor in to do what we term forest health management work, kind of the initial heavy lifting, so to speak. And when I talk about the projects, I'll talk about what sorts of activities are covered under that forest health management umbrella. It functions as a 75% reimbursement program up to the allocated project budget. And there's kind of two things to note here. One is that reimbursement can occur over in phases as the project occurs. As a portion of the work gets finished, you can contact KCD staff. We will come out, we will inspect that work, make sure that it meets the standards that we outlined in the project. And if it does, we'll be able to reimburse for that portion of work. You don't have to wait until the entire project is finished to be reimbursed. And another thing is that those reimbursement checks are considered taxable income. So just something to keep in mind if you're considering a project with us. This project is kind of designed to help lower some of the barriers to active forest management. Again, we've recognized it as a need. We've recognized that it's important. We also understand that money can be a big barrier to doing this work, especially when you're not managing for a commercial timber product. You're not going to see that return of your investment. And we want to help offset some of that initial upfront cost of doing this work. We also want to help landowners be effective land managers. A large portion of the forest land throughout Washington and in King County is in private ownership. And like I said, everybody in the area benefits from having healthy native forests, not just the landowners themselves. And so we want to give everybody the best tools they can to be good, effective stewards of their forests, so we all benefit from them. Over all of this, the program goal of the Landowner Incentive Program is to enhance our natural resources. And in this particular subset of the program, it's our forest natural resources. It's essentially a contractual agreement between the Conservation District and landowners saying, in exchange for this funding, I agree to help provide some of these natural resource benefits and improvements. And I just wanted to show a couple examples of properties that might be suitable for a cost share or an LIP project. This picture here looks similar to the degraded forest I showed earlier. There's a lot of sameness. Again, we don't have a lot of diversity or complexity in this forest. Again, the overstory is a single species of trees. There's not too much going on in the understory. This forest was likely a old timber plantation that was replanted and then abandoned or sold off. It wasn't thinned when it needed to be, and so now these trees are starting to compete very heavily with each other for resources. And in this third picture, we can see this immediate area doesn't have much in the way of overstory canopy, and invasive species have totally occupied this canopy gap here. So just a couple examples of forest types that would fit pretty well into this program. So who's eligible to apply for our Landowner Incentive Program? As I mentioned, King County is our service boundary, and so only forested parcels within the county are eligible for this program. Also, there needs to be a current forest stewardship plan that covers that forest approved and on file with King County. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that it allows for some slight regulatory flexibility around doing some of this forest health management work. And the other is that we want to help landowners implement their forest stewardship plans. Again, we want everybody to be good, effective land managers. You have this guiding document that identifies your goals for your forest and the management needed to get there, but there's something in the way potentially that's stopping you from being able to do that management. And again, finance is a big one of those, and so that's where KCD can come in and help address that barrier. So what are the program requirements? It is a 15-year practice lifetime, and what that essentially means is that anywhere that we do work for this practice needs to continue to be maintained as native forest cover for at least that 15-year window. And that maintenance really typically composes of two main things: continued control of any invasive weeds if they are present, as well as replanting if any mortality of the plants that we've planted in this project occurs throughout that 15-year window. I mentioned it's a 75% reimbursement program. The other 25% of the cost is the landowner's responsibility for this project. We will do several follow-up visits throughout this practice lifetime, and the purpose of those is kind of twofold. It's one, for us to check on the practice itself to see how things are doing with the work that we put on the ground. And it's also an opportunity for us to check in with you as the landowners, see how things are going, if you're having any issues or concerns with the maintenance obligation for the practice, or if you require any kind of assistance to continue to do that maintenance. And on years that we're not out doing site visits, we will require a submission of photos every year, again, just as an opportunity for us to kind of get eyes on the project, see how things are doing, and potentially catch a possible concern before it becomes a much larger issue in that project. So I'm going to take a quick break here and see if any questions came in about the program itself before I get into talking more specifically about the projects and get a little bit more details about those.
Hey, Brett. So we got a question from Crane, and Crane says, I did a stream buffer fence cost share. It was great. Does this fit in with CREP? And that's the CREP program.
Yeah, so what Crane is talking about is the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. It's a similar sort of program. It's an incentive for people to keep their resources naturally vegetated as opposed to clearing for agriculture, for example. It's not quite the same as CREP, but the intent is similar. And that, again, we really want people to continue to use continue to keep their resources in the most natural setting possible, as opposed to clearing them or developing them or using them for any kind of other land use. Hopefully that kind of gets at what you're asking there, Crane.
All right, the next question is from Mike Gall. What's the minimum parcel size considered for assistance?
Hey, Mike, there's not necessarily a minimum parcel size explicitly by the program. However, the market is kind of the limiting factor there. Our past experience has just been smaller projects, typically those around an acre or smaller. It's more difficult for landowners to find a contractor willing to bid on that project. We don't have in our program any set minimums, so if you're able to find somebody who is willing to do that work, we'll consider essentially a parcel of any size. I guess the caveat would be the size of the forest, and if it's connected to a larger forested area, or if it's more maybe just a small area of trees in the middle of your lawn, for example. And that's something that we'll kind of assess on a case-by-case basis. But typically anything smaller than an acre or connected to a smaller than an acre portion of forest doesn't necessarily fit so much within this program. But again, I'm happy to talk with you maybe more after this presentation and get a sense of the size of your property and whether or not it would be a good fit for this program or not.
All right. Next question is from Julia. Hi, my property is bordered by a green belt and there are some large cedar trees that need maintenance that is very expensive and hard for me to afford. Would this program work for me?
I guess the two questions would be if those cedar trees are on your property on the green belts. And then the other question would be, what exactly do you mean by maintenance of those trees? Typically, things that fall more under like what an arborist would do, which would be pruning, for example, don't necessarily fit within this program. The intent for our program is more overall forest health. Things like pruning don't really contribute to the overall health of the forest. It's more of a human sort of concern or potential like visibility or aesthetics, as opposed to managing for the overall health of that forest.
And Julia said they are located in the greenbelt, but close enough to my property boundary that I'm financially liable for them. And one of the trees has a large cavity, which she's been told that can make it hazardous.
Okay, so we wouldn't be able to work directly with a project on anything that would be affecting those trees. Again, they're not yours necessarily, they're not on your property, it's somebody else's property, so we would have to be working with the property owner or potentially the organization that does have ownership of that green belt to address anything with those trees. And again, it's something that I would have to, I guess, see or learn a little bit more about to be able to judge whether or not it's something that we would classify, again, as a forest resource concern, or if it is more of a potential property or human concern. But I'm certainly happy to talk more with you after this presentation. I'll have my contact information on the last slide.
And Karen asked, is this kind of program available in other counties?
I don't believe there's any other conservation districts nearby that have this sort of program available. However, there is a federal equivalent that I'll talk about near the end that does very similar things. It functions in a very similar way that's open to anybody in the US. It is a federal countrywide program.
And then this will be the last one for this Q&A. This is from Chris. If approved, does this program usually agree to pay the 75% before a project starts?
No, so again, it is a reimbursement program. And so work would occur, you would be invoiced for that work from the contractor, you would pay that invoice, we would come out to inspect and then reimburse 75% of that cost. We are always looking at ways to kind of revamp and improve our services, and that's kind of been a question that's been coming up as far as the sort of payment structure. But currently, that's the way that our program functions is again, as a reimbursement program as opposed to paying this money out upfront. Thank you all for your questions. So we're going to go ahead and continue and talk a little bit more about what these cost share, what these LIP projects look like, some of the details about them. Again, what they look like, type of activities that we generally include in these projects, typical timelines for the projects, mentioned 15-year lifetime. I'll talk about how that kind of breaks down. Some of the requirements and some of what we ask from landowners before, during, and after engaging in a project with us. And lastly, what project success looks like. How do we determine whether or not we've been successful with these projects? So first off, what do they look like? Typical activities usually start with site preparation, which is any activity to prepare the area for replanting. Includes things like brush control, mowing, thinning, and invasive species treatment. In the picture below is an area that's been site prepped, probably with mowing. Most all of that brown area was Himalayan blackberry. Those came and mowed out and treated to free up space to establish some native vegetation. And I mentioned replanting. We only plant native species, species whose native range is this part of Washington. And this is a site, again, that was site prepped with a similar treatment. And then all of those white tubes have seedlings in them. Those tubes are there to protect from wildlife damage. And lastly, maintenance, which essentially is any combination of site preparation and replanting activities that are necessary throughout the lifetime of that practice to ensure continued success. And essentially we want trees to get to about the size in this last photo. So how long do they take? How does that 15-year practice lifetime break down? Year 1 or year 0 starts with installation, which is our initial site preparation and planting activities. Once those are done, that kind of starts the 15-year clock from ticking there. And after that initial site prep, after that initial planting, it goes into maintenance, which can split into 2 separate phases. The first phase is ours, or KCDs. We always build 3 years or so of maintenance into these projects, into these contracts, to have that professional contractor come back, do any follow-up invasive species treatments, any follow-up brush control, replanting if need be, again, to ensure that things are going to be the most successful moving forward. Those first couple of years are generally pretty crucial to a successful establishment of trees that we plant. At the end of that maintenance window, we'll do a final inspection, get a sense of how everything's been doing. Have we been successful in these treatments? Is there need for additional work? Or are things looking pretty good to the point where we can then hand off the responsibility of maintenance to the landowner for the remainder of that 15-year practice lifetime. The contracts are for 15 years. However, forests are living systems, and there really is no clear end. There's likely always going to need to be some continual inputs into this forest in the form of time or potentially money or energy. But the idea is that those inputs will decrease over time as we get these forests kind of back on the track, the natural trajectory, and let natural processes take back over. So what do we need landowners to do before we engage with them in a LIP project? First, we need to have clearly defined goals. It's really hard to manage for something if you don't know what that something is. And so having a really good idea of what you want from your forest, what you want it to look like, what you plan to use it for, really helps us during the project design phase to come up with a project that's both going to meet the natural resource outcomes that we need to see and to meet the goals that you as the landowner would like to have. And also get involved with your woods. Like I mentioned, there's going to be a significant portion of that 15-year timeline where you as the landowner are going to be responsible for continued maintenance of the practice. And so any work that you do to learn what these activities look like, learn the time and energy and effort required for them, is going to help you be able to confidently say, yes, I'm comfortable taking on this commitment, or no, that might be outside of the scope of my abilities at this time. During the projects, you as the landowner will function as the project manager. Really the biggest portion of that is just clear and open and responsive communication, both between you and the contractor. You two will be working together to schedule work. They will be, again, billing you directly. You will be paying them directly, addressing anything of that nature with them and also with us. Any questions or concerns that you have come up throughout the program or throughout the project, excuse me. Any paperwork that you need assistance with, reimbursement requests, scheduling inspection visits, we need you to bring those to our attention so that we can kind of address them together with you. So just having that constant communication really helps these projects run more smoothly. And so after installation is complete, after we do that final inspection, final reimbursements, again, continued maintenance of the practice throughout that 15-year window, and again, annual submission of photos for us for our records. So when we do that final inspection, what are we looking for? What does project success look like? How do we know that things are being successful? The first is going to be good control of invasive species. And sort of the 3 things that we look for there are going to be if invasive species are not the dominant vegetation anywhere on the site, they will not have the chance to become the dominant vegetation on the site. They're not competing with or impacting the successful establishment of the trees that we plant on these projects. We're also looking for successful establishment of those plantings. And we want to see good survivorship. At least 80% of what we plant, we need to see survive. And you can see in this picture here, everywhere that has a white tube, all of those trees are alive and well and looking healthy. And we also need trees to be free to grow. And so what we mean by that is that trees will not be outcompeted by any of the surrounding native vegetation. If we were to walk away from those trees today, they would continue to grow and thrive and do great without any kind of continued management of surrounding brush of those trees. And also we want to see our landowners as active and engaged stewards. The projects are designed to do, again, some of that initial heavy lifting as far as management goes in your forest, but they're to get them to a point where you as the landowner now have the ability to continue that maintenance, continue that management as long as you own that forest. It's very rare that we'd be able to walk away from these projects completely within that first 3 or so years. So I wanted to take a couple minutes and really outline the steps going from when you first contact KCD, first express interest in this program, all the way through to the maintenance portion of the program, and who's responsible for what and kind of the order that things go. So again, it starts with clearly defined goals for the forest, and working with those goals and with the resource concerns that KCD staff had identified on your property. That's where we put your project together, where those two things, where there's overlap between them. Once we have a draft project design, we'll send it back to you for your review and approval or comments, and make sure that the project still meets the goals for your forest, as well as that you are comfortable with the management activities that we outlined in that project. Once we have your approval and we have a project that we both agree on, we'll go ahead and provide some bids to you to start soliciting, provide some documents, to you, so you can start soliciting bids from contractors. You'll go ahead, head out into the market, start soliciting bids, select a contractor, select a bid that you're comfortable with. And once we have that bid, we'll use that, as well as the documents that we've already made, to complete your project application. Again, we'll send that application back to you for your review. There shouldn't really be anything new at this point, but we still just like to get final confirmation that everything still looks good to the landowner. Once we have that, KCD staff will submit that application for approval to our internal review committee. That body meets every month, and so it's typically a pretty short turnaround from when we have this application ready to submit to when we know if the project has been approved or not. If the project gets approved, you'll go ahead and sign your contract. You'll receive your approval letter from us, and at that point, you're free to tell the contractor work can begin. We're ready to start the project. If the project doesn't get approved, it's not the end of the world. We can make the changes, any changes that the review committee suggested or wanted to see. So long as those still match up with the goals that you have, we can then resubmit that project for approval at a later date. And once work begins, KCD staff is there again to inspect work as it occurs, help you process any paperwork, and just generally ongoing support with the continued maintenance of the practice throughout that whole 15-year window. It kind of seems like there's a lot going on here, but it's really broken out into 4 main phases. The first phase is the project design, or the scoping phase, where we work with you around your goals and the resource concerns to put together a project. Once we have a good draft of that project, we provide you with documents for you to be able to solicit bids for the project. Once we have that bid, we complete your application and submit it for the internal review process. And once we receive approval, you're free to, again, tell the contractor to begin work on your project. So that about wraps it up for my talk. I'm going ahead and just kind of hit some of the key points, key takeaways that I want to make sure everybody got from today's presentation. I introduced KCD as an organization for those of you who, again, weren't familiar with us. Again, we're a special purpose district, separate from the county, non-regulatory, non-enforcement. We rely, again, on voluntary participation from landowners. And then our services generally fall within the 3 categories of education, technical assistance, and financial assistance. Okay, you have hopefully enough historical context to justify why we want to do this work, why we think that it's important. Basically just the historical land use over the past 100, 150 years has resulted in some degraded conditions in parts of the forests here in King County, and that human active management can help to address some of that degradation and kind of redirect the forests back onto a more natural pathway. Talked about the landowner incentive program, gave an overview as well as program requirements. Again, it's the financial assistance piece of KCD services. It's a 75% reimbursement program eligible to any forested parcels within King County that have an approved forest stewardship plan that cover them. And again, the practice lifetime is 15 years. Again, just an overview of the LIP projects. The main activities include site preparation, replanting, and maintenance. And that maintenance occurs in 2 phases. One is the first 3 years after that initial installation, where we have the contractor come back out and continue to do follow-up treatment as necessary. And the second phase, that remaining 10 to 12 years, where it becomes the landowner's responsibility. And again, project success, we need to see good control of invasive weeds and successful establishment of plantings, and our landowners as active and engaged stewards moving forward into the future. So that wraps up the summary. I will have, again, a brief time for question and answers. I did want to at least get through this, some additional resources before we get to that question and answer section now. So here are some partner agencies and agencies we kind of work alongside with, doing similar work to us, or offer services that are sort of ancillary and sort of support what we're doing. The first is the one that I mentioned earlier, is the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They're a branch of the Department of Agriculture. Again, it's a federal program, but they operate very similarly to conservation districts. They are also non-regulatory, non-enforcement, and they have their EQIP, or Environmental Quality Incentive Program, which is a very similar cost share program to the one I just talked about today. It's typically a better fit for a larger property, just based on how that program is set up. King County also has a forestry program that offers planning assistance. If you need help developing a stewardship plan for your property, they also have some potential property tax savings programs for people who want to keep their land in natural forest. The Washington Department of Natural Resources also has planning assistance. Stewardship forester is Matt Provencher. He's available to help with properties greater than 10 acres, and he's able to work with landowners to help develop a stewardship plan for their forests. Washington State University Extension has some pretty great educational classes and webinars for forest landowners, and they also have what's called their Coached Forest Stewardship Planning class, which is a 9-week class that teaches forest landowners pretty much everything they need to know to develop their own stewardship plan for their forest. And we definitely highly recommend it if you're able to take that class. And lastly, KCD, of course. I can help offer planning assistance for people who have less than 5 acres of forest on their property. LIP cost share, of course, and the technical assistance piece. If you have any questions about anything at all, or think of anything that I've talked about today, or just natural resources in general, I'm more than happy to talk to you at length about any of that. My email and phone numbers are there at the bottom. And it sounds like we got the poll up and running, so I'm going to go ahead and start the post presentation poll here. So you should, for real this time, see a separate box pop up with a couple of multiple choice questions. So just go ahead, take some time, read through those questions, and answer them to the best of your knowledge. And I'll go ahead and share the results of those out once we have most everybody's responses back. And once we have everybody's responses in, I'll have some time set aside for question and answers for any additional questions that came in during the second half of that presentation. Waiting on just 2 more sets of responses. All right, so we're going to go ahead and end the poll here. Thank you all for your participation. I'm going to share the results out. Looks like most everybody did pretty well. I just wanted to go through and talk about the right answers and why they are the right answers. So for the first question, what does a landowner need before applying for a KCD forest cost share project? The correct answer is A, we do need to see an up-to-date forest stewardship plan approved by a King County forester. B is kind of close, it's a little tricky. However, we would need that plan to cover the entire project area for us to be able to do a cost share project on that property. For question 2, who solicits the bids for a forest cost share project and selects the contractor that will do the work? That is the landowner's responsibility. The KCD planner will provide the documents for you to do so. We can direct you to resources on where to find those contractors, but ultimately it is the landowner who solicits those bids and who selects the bid and the contractor that they want to work with. So for question 3, who functions as the project manager for doing KCD and cost share projects? Again, that's going to be the landowner's responsibility. KCD planner is there to help facilitate that as needed, facilitate any conversations between you and the contractor. If there's any trouble communicating, the contractors are generally pretty self-sufficient. They have a good handle on this work and don't tend to need too much guidance. But we do, again, rely on that communication from you as the landowner, between you and the contractor and between you and us here at KCD for these projects to really run super smoothly. Question 4, I think I hammered that one home pretty well enough. How long are landowners required to maintain a cost share project? 15 years. And question 5, what does success look like? Everybody got that one right. All of the above. Good control of invasives, plantings are free to grow, and landowners are active and engaged stewards of their forests. So thank you all again for your participation with that. We're going to go ahead and take some questions now. I believe we have about 10 or 15 minutes here left for questions.
All right, so the first question is from Crane. Can you only apply once?
Yes, Crane, you can. There is only currently one project per landowner, per property for just being able to kind of distribute funding as equitably as possible. We only allow landowners to apply once for this particular cost share.
All right, next question is from Mike. How do we access program services? We bought native species from the yard sale this spring, but if contractor services are available, we'd be very happy to access them.
You would contact me directly. Again, my contact info is at the bottom of the screen there. We'll start that conversation of what you want to have done, what your property looks like, and where we can potentially have a good fit for a cost share project. So I'll be the point person that you can reach out to. Again, email or phone, either is fine by me.
All right, next question is from Karen. According to many experts, fir trees will be very adversely affected by climate change. So how will you address that concern if you insist on planting only native species? Are you considering recommending trees in particular that may not be locally native?
That's a great question. It's something that we've struggled with a little bit. Currently, we're not looking at sourcing trees from outside of native ranges, for example, looking south, maybe the redwoods and sequoias. That's not something that we're going to explore at the moment. Typically, what we're starting to do with projects moving forward is just plan for trees that are going to be more drought tolerant. The science is pretty well in agreement that summers are going to be drier, and so trees that are going to be more able to tolerate those conditions, we're starting to include more heavily in our projects. Beyond that, we aren't currently doing too much else as far as adjusting for climate change, simply because the research isn't really there with definitive guidance on the best paths forward there. So it's really hard for us to be able to say and feel really confidently making a change like sourcing non-native or plants that are kind of just outside of their native range. It's something that we've definitely talked about a lot, though, and we're keeping a close eye on the science to be able to adapt to kind of the best practices that as they come out with respect to climate change.
All right, next two questions are from Crane and Chris. My struggle has been finding a contractor who will work within the allotted budget, but that's USDA. Do you have contractors who can work with us? What is the average cost? And from Chris, do you all have a list of suggested contractors or know a great site to get this information? Tips on what type of contractors to look for?
So we do have a list of contractors that we have worked with in the past that we send to landowners. We've seen their work. We know they do good work. They understand how our program works, and they understand the work and how it needs to be done. So we send that along. WSU Extension, if you go to their website, also has a consulting forester database. You can search by county, you can search by service type, and there is quite a bit of contractors that are on in that database. Again, finding contractors doing this work on a smaller scale has been a struggle for a lot of landowners. We don't really have a good solution to that, unfortunately, at this time, but it is something that we're working with. We're always open to working with new contractors as they come into the market. But we do understand that it has been pretty difficult for especially smaller forest landowners to find a contractor, like Crane said, working within that budget. If the project cost goes over the maximum budget, we can still do that project. However, we wouldn't be able to reimburse for expenses over that project cap. So that's not it doesn't totally exclude you from being eligible for this program. It just means that there might be a little bit more cost from you as the landowner for that project.
All right, and this question is from Patricia. Is there a list of types of projects? For example, can it be thinning the forest?
Yes, thinning is absolutely a practice that we've done on projects in the past and will continue to do so. Again, overall forest health is kind of the big overarching theme of what we're looking for as far as resource concerns and opportunities for management. And when forests are overstocked, when there's too many trees, that's definitely a resource concern, especially as summers get drier, water is less available. Those trees are going to compete a lot with each other, and water is typically going to be the limiting resource there. So we will absolutely, yes, consider thinning a thinning project.
This question is from Russ. Can the landowner do the work instead of a contractor and receive reimbursement?
They can, Russ. That is some conversation that we've been having internally as to how to kind of structure those types of projects. Currently, we don't have a really solid way, I guess, to potentially provide that support to landowners that they need. With contractors, we can be a little more general when we design the projects, putting that language on paper, because again, they understand really well what those things look like and the general best practices. With landowners, we're not always speaking the same language. We don't have as good a sense of kind of their expertise, their knowledge, and so that's something that we'll kind of work with that landowner and figure out how much do you know, how comfortable are you, do you have the skills, do you have the ability, do you have the equipment to do this work? And if we determine that, yes, that landowner is definitely capable of doing this work, you can absolutely do the work and receive the reimbursement instead, correct? All right, it looks like that's it for questions. Again, my contact information is at the bottom of the screen there, so don't hesitate to give me a call or shoot me an email if anything comes to mind after this presentation. But thank you all so much for attending. I have a thank you slide for you all. And please, I believe we'll be following up with a survey for feedback. I really would appreciate any feedback at all for today's presentation to help us do better for future instances of this program, as well as future webinars that we do. If there's any other topics or any other information you want to see covered in this type of format, please let us know. We're definitely exploring this format for getting more information out there to landowners. But thank you all again for attending, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.